It began not with thunder, but with a chuckle, sharp, quiet, dismissive. Officer Doyle, lounging in the back of the courtroom, smirked as a tall black man stepped through the double doors. He nudged his partner, Officer Landon, with the back of his hand. "Bet he's some smooth-talking public defender," he muttered, eyes narrowing with the kind of condescension born not from insight but assumption. The man didn't hear him. Or if he did, he didn't care. He walked slowly but purposefully down the aisle, dressed in a charcoal gray suit so finely tailored it looked like it had been sewn onto his posture. His shoes were polished, his expression unreadable, and his hands clasped gently in front of him, as if carrying something invisible but heavy. "Sorry to interrupt the story. Before we continue, we'd really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us get closer to 1,000 subscribers. It means the world to us. Thank you so much." He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He simply was a calm, unshakable presence cutting through a space that had already decided what he must be. He nodded once, politely, to the judge, then sat in the third row, center. A seat anyone else would take without notice. But his skin made it different. To Doyle and Landon, he wasn't a stranger. He was a silhouette. An idea. Another black man in a courtroom, probably some relative playing important. The irony, of course, was cruel. They saw his complexion before they saw his credentials, his humanity, his weight. And that right there was their first and gravest mistake. Outside, the media buzzed with anticipation over the trial of Terren Cole, a young black college student accused of assaulting an officer. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the air thick with barely restrained tension. Everyone seemed to sense that this wasn't just another case. Something larger was stirring beneath the surface. But the man in the suit remained quiet, unmoved. His presence wasn't loud. It was anchored, deliberate. He didn't come to be seen. He came to see. And when the moment arrived, they would learn exactly who had walked in. But not yet. For now, he was just a shadow in the third row, still, silent, and vastly underestimated. Outside, the courthouse pulsed with media noise. Camera crews jostled for angles, reporters rehearsed somber lines, and headlines were already half-written. "Black teen on trial for assaulting police." But those words were too neat, too small for the storm that brewed inside. Inside, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as if it knew what was coming before anyone else did. Terren Cole sat at the defense table, barely 20, his shoulders hunched like they carried more than just the weight of this trial. His eyes were tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the kind of exhaustion that comes from being seen as a threat long before you're seen as a person. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, knuckles pale, as though clinging to whatever was left of his faith in a system that had already branded him dangerous. Behind him, his mother sat with a small Bible clutched in her lap. Her lips moved silently, prayers stitched into each breath. Every time her son exhaled, she inhaled sharply, as if trying to hold his suffering inside her own ribs. Across the aisle, Officers Doyle and Landon leaned back in their chairs, confidence oozing like oil on concrete. They chuckled under their breath, exchanged smirks, and threw glances toward the man in the gray suit, the one who hadn't said a word, hadn't moved since he entered. "Probably some family member trying to look important," Landon whispered. "Trying to be the next Perry Mason." Doyle stifled a laugh. But he practiced that walk. They didn't notice the way the assistant district attorney hesitated slightly when her eyes found the man in the third row. They didn't catch the judge's faint nod in his direction. They didn't see the quiet shift in posture from the court clerk or the bailiff. All they saw was a black man in a nice suit, sitting where he didn't belong. As the prosecution began its case, their voices rang with manufactured certainty. The defendant was aggressive, they said. Uncooperative. Feared for our safety, Landon testified with the kind of performance that had been perfected over years of rehearsals in countless courtrooms. There were no bruises on the officers, no hospital visits, no body cam footage it was missing, they claimed. Just paperwork and a narrative that had been used far too many times. The defense, young and overworked, tried to paint the truth that Terrence had earbuds in, hadn't heard their calls, had raised his hands when he finally noticed them, that he told them he was unarmed, that they tackled him anyway. But truth in court is often less persuasive than perception. Still, something in the room was changing. It was in the way silence fell heavier after each testimony, in the way people in the gallery began watching the man in the suit instead of the lawyers, in the way Terrence, For a flicker of a second, turned his head not to look for his mother, but toward the third row, as if sensing something or someone who might understand. The judge called for a recess, and in the pause that followed, the air shifted again, like the moment before a storm, because the man in the suit was about to rise. And when he did, no one in that courtroom would ever forget what followed. The courtroom settled into a quiet hum as the defense took their final stand, not with bombast or spectacle, but with the steady rhythm of truth. The young attorney, voice steady but worn, laid it all out. Terren Cole, a 19-year-old college student, was walking home from a friend's apartment. He had earbuds in, a backpack slung over one shoulder, and his head down like any student might be after a long night of studying or a late movie. The officers had claimed they called out, that he ignored them, that he looked shifty, that he moved too quickly. But the defense pointed out what anyone with brown skin in America already knew: fear doesn't have to look hostile to be real. Panic doesn't need a weapon to justify itself. Terrence, they said, saw two officers moving toward him fast, hands near their weapons. He raised his hands. He said, "I'm unarmed." And they tackled him anyway. On the stand, Officer Landon looked straight ahead, his jaw tight, voice laced with righteous indignation. "We feared for our safety," he repeated, as if the words were a shield, as if fear alone was enough to erase context, youth, innocence. But there were no bruises, no broken skin, no hospital reports, just a stack of paperwork, two confident officers, and a body cam that had somehow disappeared. The courtroom didn't erupt, it recoiled, slowly, quietly, like a breath being held. And through it all, the man in the charcoal suit sat still, observing, listening. His eyes moved from the witness stand to Terrence's trembling hands, then to the judge, who looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. This wasn't just a trial. It was a mirror, a reflection of a system that didn't need proof to convict, only perception. A system where a young black man with earbuds became a suspect before a name was ever asked, where fear wore a badge and the burden of proof always fell on the ones least equipped to carry it. When the judge finally called for a recess, it wasn't just to pause the proceedings. It felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. As people stood and stretched and filed toward hallways and restrooms, the tension didn't move, it settled deeper, like dust in sunlight. And then he rose. The man in the suit. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just enough to stand. And the moment he did, the atmosphere shifted like the crackle in the air before a thunderstorm. No one could explain why. They just felt it. Because sometimes change doesn't enter with a bang. It walks in quietly, takes a seat in the third row, and waits. Until the system finally has to look it in the eye. The room had not yet returned from recess when the man in the charcoal suit stood. No sound announced his rising. No guard shifted. No one summoned him forward. And yet, the very air in the courtroom changed. Not from noise, but from presence. He stepped toward the front, moving past the rows of attorneys and startled onlookers. Past Terrence. Past the defense table. Until he stood before the bench with the quiet authority of someone who had long stopped needing permission. "If I may address the court," he said, his voice low, warm, unhurried. The judge, who had been presiding with the detached calm of someone balancing a dozen trials at once, straightened slightly. Then something rare, a faint smile, a glimmer of recognition. "Of course, Director Ellis," she said. It was as if a switch had been thrown. Gasp rippled across the courtroom like a rising tide. The officers Doyle and Landon visibly stiffened. A woman dropped her pen. A teenage observer whispered something, breathless. "Director," one voice murmured. "FBI." The man turned to face the room. The stillness around him grew. His voice, though gentle, rang with a weight that could not be ignored. "My name is Calvin Ellis. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." He paused, allowing the truth of that statement to land. "But I didn't come here today wearing that title," he continued. "I came as a black man in America. Because when I read the details of this case, I saw something painfully familiar. I saw missing footage. I saw inconsistencies. I saw a young man criminalized not for what he did, but for how he looked. I saw officers who saw skin before seeing a son, a student, a human being." His words didn't rise in volume, but in gravity. Each one carried years, decades, generations. "I, too, have been followed in stores. I've had weapons drawn on me while jogging. I've been asked to explain my presence in buildings I had every right to enter. The only difference between Terren Cole and me is this suit. And the title stitched to it. He turned his gaze toward the officers. Doyle looked away. Landon clenched his jaw. I wonder, Ellis continued, had I walked in here today in a hoodie and sneakers, would you have mocked me too? Would you have assumed the worst and written a story in your heads before hearing a word from my mouth? Silence, thick and undeniable, answered him. Then he turned to Terrence, whose eyes were wide, lips parted in stunned disbelief. You are not invisible, he said gently. You matter. You are not the mistake in someone else's story. You are the author of your own. The courtroom did not erupt in applause. It didn't need to. Some moments don't ask for noise. They demand reflection. And in that moment, no one in the room, not even the ones who had laughed, could deny that something larger than a trial had just taken place. It wasn't just a reveal. It was a reckoning. The jury didn't take long. For all the complexities the prosecution tried to spin, for all the pages of testimony, the embellished narratives, the shaky justifications, when it came down to truth, the jurors saw through the fog. 1 hour and 42 minutes. That's all it took. When they returned, their faces were solemn but clear. The foreperson stood, voice steady as stone. On the charge of assaulting a police officer, not guilty. On the charge of resisting arrest, not guilty. There was no eruption, no gasp, just a deep exhale from the room itself, as if it had been holding its breath the entire trial. Terrence's mother wept softly, not the kind of weeping born from joy, but the tremble of someone who had braced themselves too long for heartbreak, only to feel for once the weight lift instead of land. Terrence sat frozen, like a man still trying to process the fact that this time the world had listened. Outside the courthouse, the world had already moved. Reporters filled the sidewalks, camera flashes slicing the early evening haze. The video of Director Ellis' speech was everywhere, shared, reposted, dissected. Headlines read, FBI Director's Courtroom, stand goes viral, and a black suit, a black voice, a system shaken. But Ellis wasn't at the microphones. He didn't step behind a podium or issue a press release. Instead, he found Terrence and his mother standing beneath the courthouse steps, quiet, surrounded but alone. The director approached not as a public figure, not as an icon, but as a man. Thank you, sir, Terrence whispered, his voice breaking, eyes shining. You didn't have to. Yes, Ellis interrupted, gentle but firm. Yes, I did. Because one day it'll be your turn to do it for someone else. That was all. No lecture. No fanfare. Just a passing of something unspoken, call it responsibility, call it hope. That night, in a quiet precinct office where the coffee had gone cold and the lights flickered slightly in the corners, Officer Doyle placed his badge on a desk. He said nothing. No apology, no argument. Just a long look at the shield he once wore, and then he walked out. Officer Landon didn't resign. But he didn't return to the field either. The department placed him on immediate administrative leave, pending further review. The mayor's office, pressed by rising voices and viral outrage, issued a statement before midnight. This case is a sobering reminder of the systemic failures that persist. We are committed to deep review and immediate reforms. But no statement could erase the humiliation carved into that courtroom. No memo could soften the hard truth that had been spoken with such clarity. That night, across the country, people who had long felt unseen saw themselves in a new light. And somewhere in a quiet corner of the Capitol, Calvin Ellis sat alone at his desk. The city pulsed beyond his window. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just stared into the dark and whispered, almost to himself. This time I didn't stay silent. And silence would never be the same again. The sun had barely broken over the horizon when Director Calvin Ellis returned to his office in Washington, D.C. The early light painted long, golden lines across the marble floors of the Hoover Building. Outside, the Capitol stirred, cars crawling, footsteps echoing, but inside his office it was still. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't reach for the day's briefing folders or check his calendar. He simply sat. Not like a man in power. Not like a figurehead of an institution, but like a man who had just laid down a burden too long carried in silence. He leaned back, eyes resting on the edge of the window where the skyline blurred against the soft light of morning. His thoughts weren't on policy or press cycles. They were on something older, deeper, memory. He remembered every time he'd been followed in a department store, every time a cab had passed him by, every time someone had looked at him and seen only what they feared. He remembered walking into rooms and watching shoulders stiffen. He remembered learning the script: smile, lower your tone, never challenge too soon, never forget to prove you belong. Proving. Always proving. Even with the title Director of the FBI, it had never stopped. Even then, it had taken a courtroom, a suit, and the edge of his voice to remind them that black doesn't mean threat. That presence doesn't mean danger. He closed his eyes for a long moment. Respect should never depend on appearances, he whispered to the empty room. Justice must not depend on titles. And the worth of a man must never be defined by the color of his skin. The words weren't new. They had lived inside him for decades, waiting for the moment when saying them out loud would matter not just for himself, but for someone who couldn't speak without being silenced. Across his desk sat a photo. It was old, its edges softened by time. A young Ellis in his academy days, back straight, fists clenched just out of frame, jawline tight with conviction. He hadn't known then how many rooms he would have to enter twice. How many truths would be questioned simply because of who he was. But now, after that courtroom, after Terrence, after the silence had finally cracked open, he knew one thing for sure. Not everyone would change. Not every officer would reflect. Not every mind would open. But some did. And sometimes, in a world as weary as this one, that's enough to begin. He finally reached for his pen. There was more to do. More reforms. More speaking. More quiet revolutions to set in motion. But for a few more minutes he let the stillness linger, not as an absence, but as a space where something sacred had been said. Because in a nation built on voices, it's the ones we almost never hear, the ones long denied their place, that echo the farthest. 1 week later, the courtroom was empty, but the resonance of what had happened there still rippled far beyond its four walls. Across the country, conversations were shifting in police stations, in college lecture halls, at kitchen tables where parents spoke carefully to their children about the world they were growing up in. In that courtroom, Director Calvin Ellis had stood not just as the head of a federal agency, but as a living reminder of two truths: how easily justice could be distorted, and how power, when wielded with grace, could reshape the air around it. Now, 1 week later, his speech had surpassed 15 million views. Teachers replayed it in classrooms, asking students, "What do you think he meant when he said, 'The only difference between me and Terrence is this suit'?" A police academy in Illinois has added it to their implicit bias training. A mother in Oakland printed his words and taped them above her son's bed. But for Terren Cole, life hadn't settled back into normal. He still hadn't slept through the night. The courtroom had set him free, but it hadn't erased the moment when he felt hands on his back, knees in his ribs, fear clamped across his chest like a second set of cuffs. Still, something was different now. He walked taller, not because he felt brave, but because someone like Ellis had looked at him and said, "You are not invisible." At home, his mother kept replaying that moment on the courthouse steps when Ellis had said, "One day it'll be your turn to do this for someone else." She'd written it down in her Bible. Not because she thought her son would become famous, but because it reminded her that dignity didn't come from titles. It came from being seen. Meanwhile, Officer Doyle's resignation had sparked an internal memo within his department, a review of field practices with new procedures for traffic stops, street questioning, and courtroom conduct. Officer Landon hadn't spoken to the press. Not yet. But his silence was now filled with a discomfort he couldn't shake. For the first time in his career, the joke hadn't landed. The smirk hadn't shielded him. His actions had been watched, judged not just by a courtroom, but by a nation. And back in D.C., Director Ellis returned to his work quietly. He didn't mention the trial in his briefings. He didn't name it in public memos. But he did add one line to the draft of the Bureau's upcoming internal statement. Justice is not restored by silence. It begins with those willing to say, "I see you." Because 1 week later, what mattered most wasn't the applause. It was the echo still carried by those who had heard it, still moving through places where silence had once ruled. Months passed, but the memory of that day in the courtroom refused to fade. It had become something more than a headline, more than a viral moment. It had settled into the cultural conscience like a quiet stone at the bottom of a deep well. Not flashy, not loud, but lasting. Director Calvin Ellis continued his work with steadfast focus. He didn't dwell on the courtroom speech, nor did he bask in the praise that followed. For him, that day had never been about making a statement. It had been about stepping in because silence would have made him complicit. In those months, policies shifted slowly, yes, but perceptibly. At the FBI, a new bias training module was quietly added, inspired by the language of his remarks. Community liaisons in departments nationwide were directed to review use of force cases with a fresh lens. Officers were now required to review a simple but powerful question before every interaction. Am I responding to behavior or to bias? Some resisted. Change always met friction. But others, especially the younger officers, leaned in. They had watched the clip. They had read the transcript. And something in the clarity of Ellis' voice had gotten through. Across the country, Terren Cole was rebuilding his life. School had resumed, though he still found it hard to focus in crowded rooms. There were days when he walked into a store and felt every eye on him again. The trauma hadn't vanished, but neither had the courage. He had started writing a blog at first, then guest pieces on youth justice, equity, and the weight of silence. He didn't call himself an activist. He called himself someone who remembered what it felt like to be unseen. Once he received an email from a student in Minneapolis who said, "I watched your case. I watched the man who stood up for you. And now, I want to study law." Terrence reread that email twice. Then he saved it in a folder called Purpose. And as for Officer Landon, he remained on leave pending review, pending decision. In the quiet of those months, something had shifted in him too. Not enough to erase what had been done, but maybe enough to understand it. He didn't speak to the press. But he wrote one letter, folded neatly, never sent. I didn't see him. I only saw a story I'd been taught. I know better now. Back in Washington, Ellis kept that photo of the courtroom on his desk not because he needed the reminder, but because others did. The photo wasn't of him speaking. It was of Terrence just after the verdict, just before stepping outside. He was looking up. Hope and disbelief still danced in his eyes. And Ellis understood, deeply, what that look meant. Because he'd worn it once too. Note: this story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising awareness. It highlights issues of responsibility, justice, and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.